It's our demise if we're divided, but unified we will survive. Oh, my head has been anointed, so like the phoenix we will rise. And even when they try to block our way, they can't break us down. They can't take my crown, no way. And it's only to the Father whom I pray, so they can't block my sound. They can't shake my ground, no day.
Okay, how we doing out there? Welcome to the second episode of One Love with Jay. Let's get into it. The purpose of receiving advice, advisor's role. So some people think that going to counseling or therapy is the way to receive, answers to their problems. They look for specific solutions to solve the things that they're dealing with. But the first and primary objective of receiving advice is to understand yourself better and to understand why you make certain decisions. The what is important. What you say and what you do matters, but you need to understand why. Why do I keep speaking that way? Why do I keep responding like this? Whether it's from your upbringing, the community you grew up in, or the people you hang around, something or someone has contributed to the shaping of your personality and who you are today. We all have internal underlying issues that causes us to react and respond in a certain way. So step one is to identify those issues. You can grow if you keep ignoring known issues in your life. And you also need to understand how your attitude and behaviors affect those around you. So my job and people like me with God-given insight, we're blessed to be able to help you to identify those issues and then teach you how to remove them. Our job isn't always to give you specific answers to your questions. What to do, where to go, who to marry, what job to take, how to make and manage your money. These are answers that we can give you generally, but not always specifically. Now God can speak through others to give you specific answers to certain questions. But keep in mind that no human being has all the answers to all your questions. Your pastor, priest, spouse, or even best friend, with good intentions, they still have to rely on God, to make their own decisions. So they don't know the exact move to make, all the time. Only God can know if a week from now, a month from now, or years from now, if that's the right decision to make today. And this is why it is so important to not only have a relationship with God, but also to have a daily connection with God so he can help you maneuver through everyday life. The people and or person that you confide in the most probably won't be with you every second of every day to help you make every decision. You ultimately have to grow to be able to make good real-time decisions on your own, because your life is the sum total and your current situation of all your decisions, past and present, whether good or bad. Okay, so foundation and environment. So when I was at MHP, doing at-home counseling, there was a common issue in basically, every household. Whether the family was black or white, Hispanic or Latino, there was a root issue in pretty much, every home. And that issue was a combination of poor family structure and poor environment. I've seen situations where single parents were struggling to raise multiple kids because one of the parents were absent or in jail. I've seen grandparents struggling to raise their grandchildren with both parents being absent for a variety of reasons. Every situation I encountered pretty much had the same issue. A dysfunctional household that caused a chain reaction negative one on the kids, as well as the adults. I would teach them behavioral techniques and coping strategies that they accepted in a moment. For the most part, they were receptive and open to change when I was in the home. But what happened after I left? Reality kicked back in. Once reality kicked in, they reverted back to their old ways. Thus it didn't take me long to realize that it was very difficult for them to change, remaining in a poor or negative environment. The traditional, man and woman household, with both parents, raising all the kids, it is less common today, but that doesn't mean that you can't establish a functional household, for children to thrive. My mother was, single. She was a single parent for most of my teenage years. But I had, my grandparents, I had my father, I had my church home, I had my high school, I played sports. So I had people that gave me, a solid foundation. I made some mistakes, as a teenager, as most teenagers do, but I had people around me to correct me and to hold me accountable, for the things that I did. That foundation became important. So as I got older and I began to, make mistakes and veer down the wrong path, I was able to remember how I was raised. I was able to realize when I was going too far, in a certain direction, because of that foundation, that was given to me, when I was younger. Now imagine, children being raised without that foundation, without being taught a sense of morality and decency. We all make mistakes, and we get into some things, but, it's important to have balance to keep yourself from going too far and crossing lines, that you shouldn't cross. I've experienced a somewhat, positive, environment, and if you have, so now, you can distinguish between, right and wrong, good and bad. But a person, who has experienced a mostly negative environment, that can affect, their personality negatively as well as their future decision making. Okay, so the three basic personal skills. So when and where does a person learn the basic personal skills that are crucial for interpersonal relationships? So at school, we learn how to read, write, and perform mathematics, but who teaches a person how to listen, how to respond and communicate properly, and how to manage and control their emotions? Some say that that's what home training is for. But as we learned in a previous section, what if a child grew up in a dysfunctional household? What if the parents never matured into positive and even tempered adults? So in some situations, you have children raising children. Some people are adults by age, but mentally and emotionally, they're still adolescents within, and this cycle can continue for generations. So what about church? It's possible, but you could have went to a church that focused more on religious activity than personal behavior, or you could have not went to church at all. And I've already mentioned that schooling is primarily for, reading, writing, math, etc. So a person can basically reach adulthood and never learn how to listen, never learn how to respond and communicate properly, and never learn how to manage and control their emotions. Now let's look at these three basic personal skills and three roles that we perform as adults. Okay, so first, in parenting, a parent can be present and providing financially for that child. But what if that parent doesn't listen to that child when he or she tries to speak? What if that parent is unable to communicate to that child without being mean or disrespectful? What if that parent constantly has a bad attitude, when they interact with that child? You can see that this can have a negative effect on that child and the relationship between, parent and child. Emotional abuse can be just as painful as physical abuse and even more lasting. Now let's look at relationships. Your spouse could be, an excellent financial provider. They could be attractive and amazing at sex or intimacy. But what if they don't listen, when you try to talk to them? Or what if when you try to talk to them, they constantly speak over you? What if they're unable to express their feelings without getting upset or disrespectful? What if from day to day or even moment to moment, you don't even know which version of them you're going to get? You ask a question one day and get a particular response, and ask them the same question another day and get a totally different attitude and response. Now let's focus on that for a second. Having a background in psychology, I understand the dynamics of mental health, specifically, bipolar, for this topic. But a change of emotions is a natural human ability. We can't label or diagnose everybody as being bipolar just because of a sudden change of emotions. I do understand and acknowledge that it's a legitimate condition, but what if that person just hasn't learned how to control, their emotions? What if they just haven't learned how to gauge their responses? Some people go from 0 to 10 naturally. So it could merely be that self control and maintaining composure are just underdeveloped qualities within that person. So you can start to see how these three essential but basic qualities are extremely important, when it comes to parenting and maintaining good relationships. They can almost cancel out the good things that a person does when that individual lacks any or all of these qualities. And in most cases, in many cases, this is the reason why many relationships fail and people have trouble maintaining positive relationships with family and friends. Now, thirdly, let's examine the importance of these three basic personal skills: listening and responding, and maintaining composure at work and in certain social situations. Think about that manager who knows his or her job. They can run every station, they can perform all the duties of their subordinates. But what if that manager doesn't listen to you when you try to talk or make a suggestion? What if he or she doesn't know how to communicate or correct people in a positive way? What if when you show up to work, you don't know which version of them you're going to get? And the same goes for coworkers. Now there are work-related issues that occur because of, work performance and work ethics. But what do you commonly hear people complain about when it comes to coworkers? Personality. Personality. They're either, messy, or they always talking about people, or they have bad manners. They can't say good morning, excuse me, my bad, or even thank you. Now, we're talking about adults, not children, not teenagers, but adults. Now think about how many adults that have trouble listening, even for a few seconds, that don't know how to talk to people without being disrespectful or argumentative, that are calm and cooperative 1 minute, but start complaining and arguing the next. People would say, oh, that's how they are, they're stuck in their ways, but they can become extremely difficult to deal with. You may have family and friends, that's like that. You love them, but you get to the point where you don't even want to talk to them or be around them. So as we see, these three basic personal skills are critical, when it comes to developing and maintain healthy relationships with others. So we have adults that need to go to counseling to basically learn how to listen, how to respond, how to communicate, and how to control their emotions through anger management. Now, if you think about it, these are qualities that we should have learned as a child, developed as a teenager, and mastered as an adult. But like we say, for a variety of different reasons, they are absent in a lot of adults. So now let's look at the causes of poor internal development. Okay, so underlining issues. First and foremost, there's no way of getting around this. You cannot continue to ignore the sin in your life and expect to grow or succeed spiritually if that is indeed, one of your goals. Sin has a profound effect on the mind, the body, as well as the soul, and it also cuts you off from the blessings of God. You should also weigh the practical consequences of sin. If you really think about it, it's unhealthy to continue to engage in sexual sin and promiscuity. It's detrimental to your health and state of mind if you continue to drink excessively. If you partake in any kind of drugs that affect your attitude and behaviors in a negative way, that's hurting yourself as well as those around you. So it's not just about looking at it spiritually, but you also, should weigh the practical, consequences of living in sin. Secondly, pride. Pride is that attitude that fuels sin, and poor behaviors. Pride is when you know you have a bad attitude or ways, but you refuse to change. Pride is when you know it's wrong, but you keep doing it anyways. Pride is when you recognize that you're moving in the wrong direction, but you refuse to change or reroute. Pride is very destructive and very dangerous because it leads you in a direction that brings you farther and farther away from growth and maturity. And thirdly, this is so important as well. How do you deal with negative emotions? So all of us are subjected to dealing with negative emotions, fear, worry, doubt, loneliness, personal insecurities. So the question is, how do you cope? Do you rely on drugs and alcohol? Do you blame others and live in denial? These are all ineffective ways to fill that void in our souls. These are ways to hide and cover up our inner fears and insecurities. But they don't provide true healing and satisfaction to our souls. Hurt people like to hurt people. A lot of the meanness and ugliness that people project onto others is just a reflection of their own inner pain and struggles. There are people that have to find something and someone to be mad at because they get tired of being mad at themselves. There are people that go to counseling and say, oh, it's my job, it's my situation, oh, it's my spouse. But sometimes it's them. They are the cause of a lot of their own pain and suffering because they haven't learned how to cope with their own negative emotions. So counseling and therapy can provide you with some relief and guidance to help you change and fill that void, but know that the primary purpose of receiving advice, from the right people is to help you to identify, that junk and that blockage from within, that's keeping you from growing and maturing. It's like the saying, you can't find the forest, through the weeds. We overlook so many things in life that may be better for us, because we're focusing on the wrong things. Even more so, we sacrifice so much of God's blessings by pursuing the wrong things. So once you identify your internal and underlying issue, it becomes an individual decision to change, both practically and spiritually. Okay, so practical and spiritual decisions. So practical decisions are the basic and somewhat common sense decisions that you need to make on your own. This is a free country and God has given us all a free will. So you have to choose to make practical decisions, if you want to change. You have to decide to stop drinking or taking drugs that are affecting you negatively. You have to decide to improve your listening and communication skills. You have to decide to stop overreacting and learn how to control your emotions. But that's step one. Have you ever wondered why we make New Year's resolutions but don't stick to them? Why some people relapse and return to the things that they once tried to let go? Why some people go to counseling, learn how to better themselves, return home, but they cannot apply the things that they've learned? There are times in life where people actually do decide to change, and do better. But what if you decided to put down the bottle, but the taste won't go away? What if you've decided to give up the drugs, but the urge won't leave you alone? What if you decided to give up lust and sexual sin, but you keep getting overwhelmed by the temptation? So at this point, what should you do? How should you overcome? Okay, so now it's time to make a spiritual decision to connect to God and depend on Him for strength. We cannot overcome the things of this life on our own, in our own human effort, especially after we've indulged in certain things for so long. Now, it is important to reinforce, our decisions with self-effort. So once you've made a decision to stop drinking or limit your drinking, you should stop, going to bars or hanging out with people that once enticed you to drink. Once you've made a decision to stop lusting, you should stop feeding yourself lustful things, or hanging around people that entice you to lust. If you've made a decision to stop gambling, then you should refrain, from going to the casino. These are all good and practical decisions that you need to make to set yourself up for success. But you ultimately have to submit to the power of God to solidify that change, in your life. Only His Spirit, can provide us with the strength to make a complete and lasting change. And also to combat all of the negative emotions, raging within. Humility is the key. It's the counter to pride and the way to make those decisions stick. Why do some Christians still act like the world or revert back to their old ways? Because of a lack of humility and submission to God in spirit. Okay, so to recap everything, it's good to, seek advice or counseling, from wise people if you can't see or identify, your internal issues alone. Your next step is to examine your life and begin to make practical decisions so that you can position yourself to succeed. And ultimately, the most important decision that you have to make is to connect to God by humbly submitting to Him in spirit. Remember that God is your greatest resource. As the saying goes, the best counselor or advisor, lies within. If you have a relationship with God, you have everything you need. The issue is knowing how to access His grace and having a willingness to do so. Good people can suggest and give you advice, but it ultimately comes down, to your relationship with God, which can improve your life and your situation. I'm here to help guide you. But like I said, no human being will be able to give you all the specific answers to every one of your problems. I will give you general insight on a variety of different topics and issues. I will show you how to position yourself to succeed, but you have to grow spiritually to be able to make good daily decisions, on your own that affect your everyday life and your inner circle. We also talked about the importance of having a good foundation and providing a positive living environment for children and teenagers. First, it takes a village to properly raise a child, especially if both parents are absent. Second, the quality of your living environment is very important when it comes to growing and maturing. One of my favorite movies, Trading Places, with Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd, their characters basically switch places. They switched environment. And Eddie's character learned how to be more professional and respectable. And Dan's character, with his back against the wall, resorted to crime and violence. Now, it's a movie, but I do think that there's, some validity in this. And this is another reason why, we shouldn't judge each other. You have no idea what some people have experienced or been through. Life can bring out the worst in us sometimes, and even good people can succumb to pressure and being exposed to a negative living environment. So in closing, understand that failure isn't always a bad thing. If you learn from your mistakes, make the necessary adjustments, and do better. Failure becomes a problem when we repeatedly fail at the same things over and over again. When you repeatedly make the same bad personal decisions, the same bad relationship decisions, and the same bad financial decisions, then problems begin to mount and you find yourself in a deeper hole. You can change relationships, change jobs, change your locations 100 times, but if the same old you keeps showing up, then you'll keep experiencing the same old results. Utilize this simple tactic. Recognize, stop, and submit. Recognize, when you're doing something wrong, when you're headed in the wrong direction. Stop and learn how to improve in that particular area, and then move in the right direction by submitting to a better way. So recognize, stop, and submit for your own good and for the good of those closest to you. Peace, love, unity. Always, baby. One love.
So from the highest of peaks to the deepest of seas, I give you love, I bring you love. Oh, every word that I speak from the soles of my feet, I bring you love.